Hello, everyone. Obviously, I think you probably have already contacted you, or Mr. Guzman, or one of the counselors that will have told you this on by Tuesday. I'm in Houston. I'm dealing with a family emergency, and so I won't be here this week. So what I'm going to do is that I want to do the last of the lecture here on YouTube, and I'm going to put a link that you obviously, when you're watching this, it would have been available to you so that you can study for your last exam. Okay. And then what you'll probably do is that the counselors probably will proctor the exam, and then you'll take the exams like you normally would online in the class. But one, I want to go ahead and give you the rest of the lecture, although you will have access to the lecture notes, to go ahead and give you a brief kind of lecture about what they will look like and what we're going to talk about. Well, we left off all of your classes. We had started talking about the governor's veto power, at least. Some of you were further than that, so some of this will be a kind of a repeat. But we talked about the fact that the veto was the ability of the governor to kill a bill. It literally means I forbid. And when the governor receives a bill from the legislature, the governor has one of three options. They can sign the bill, in which case it becomes law immediately. They can veto the bill, in which they have to send it back to the legislature and tell them why they vetoed it. And the legislature has one of three options. It can do nothing and let the bill die. It can make the changes that the governor wants, send it back to the governor, in which case the governor should sign it, because that's what they said was the problem with it. And when they make those changes, there should no longer be any problems. And the last thing that the governor can do is absolutely nothing. The governor can sit there for 10 days. If after 10 days the governor hasn't signed or vetoed a bill, it becomes law without their signature. Okay? Well, when it comes to the vetoes, the veto is one of the more important powers that the governor actually has, because they literally can keep legislation from becoming law simply by vetoing it. Now, vetoes are not foolproof. Vetoes may be overridden by the legislature by a 2/3 vote in both chambers, which means if you're one vote shy of 2/3 in either chambers, more or less both of them, the veto is sustained. Well, when it comes to vetoes today, because of our hyper-partisan politics, it's virtually impossible for the legislature to overturn a governor's veto. It almost always requires some of the governor's own party to vote to override the governor's veto. And they're just not likely to do that anymore. And so if the governor vetoes a bill, the chances that bill would be overridden is very, very small. Now, generally speaking, the governor wants to be judicious with their use of vetoes. They need to be engaged in what the legislatures are doing, what laws they're bringing up, what they're saying, and let the legislature know if any important bills, especially, if there's a problem with the bill, they can say, hey, I have a problem with this. If you don't make these changes, I'm likely to veto it, so that the legislature knows that, okay, this is a problem. And then they could choose to either make the changes, or they can choose not to, and decide to go into a conflict with the governor, have the governor possibly veto it, and deal with whatever happens after that. Before the governor, though, vetoing a lot of bills is a sign of weakness. They don't want to do that if they keep from it. It's much better for the governor, a sign of much more strength, if they're able to, without vetoing, just through the threat of it, or not even really threaten it, to get the legislature to make important changes to legislation so that they like the legislation. That is way better for the governor than to be constantly vetoing things. But that is probably the ultimate power, the most important one that the governor has when it comes to influencing what laws get passed and everything else. Well, that was a classic veto. The Texas governor has another form of veto known as the line item. Now, it can only be used in specific, very certain circumstances, and it has to be a particular spending item inside of a bill. And so, what a line item veto is, quite literally, what the governor can do is they can draw a line with their pen through that line item, spending item, and out in the margin somewhere write veto. Then, if that's the only part that they had a problem with, they can go to the bottom of the bill, sign the bill, rest of the bill into law. In theory, the line item veto was supposed to allow the governor to keep extraneous spending from getting into the budget, to keep the budget in check. In practice, it doesn't really work that way. While governors will do that to line items that are important to the party that the governor doesn't belong to, they rarely going to do that to their own party members. And so it's more of a partisan weapon than anything else. But they do have that ability. Well, the last thing we're going to talk about under the veto, although it's really not a veto, is what's known as a special session. And of course, as we've talked about, the Texas legislature only meets once every 2 years for 140 days. Well, that can be problematic. Very important issues can come up, particularly economic issues, but other issues that the legislature needs to deal with, and we need the legislature to deal with it, and them not be able to deal with it. And so what a special session is that the governor may call the legislature into what's called a special session for 30 days at a time outside of the normal 140 days. And so they can say, hey, we got this very important issue we have to address. You must come back. Okay? Well, when the governor calls a special session, they can tell the legislature exactly what they may allow to work on. As long as they specify you have to work on XYZ agenda or issue, they can't work on anything else. If the governor calls the legislature back to special session but isn't very specific about what they can and cannot work on, then the legislature maybe go out on its own tangent. But since most governors are very, very good about saying this is exactly what I want you to work on, the legislature can only work on that. And so it is usually, historically it was used on important issues, vital issues. Today, sometimes not so much. Sometimes today they're more can be used for political purposes rather than really important legislative or policy issues. Well, why is the special session important? Well, one of the most important things for the governor, anyway, is that it can be used as a stick to get the attention of the legislature. And so, for example, like we said, the legislature only meets for 140 days every other year. The governor works all year long. And so for the governor, to call the legislature in a special session is not a big deal. But if you're those legislators that are not independently wealthy, that do require on a job to pay for your family's living, to make a living for your family, being called back into special session can be problematic. That means maybe up to a month, maybe more, because there is no constitutional limit to how many special sessions the governor can call. Now, there's a realistic limit, and then there's probably a political limit, but there's no constitutional limit. And so if you're called back into special session, you have to show up. If you say, well, sorry, I can't, I've got to do this important work so I can make a living, they actually will send the DPS after you, the Sergeant at Arms in the legislature, whether the House or the Senate, will send state troopers to come pick you up and drive you to the legislature because you are required to be there. Doesn't matter that you're not going to be able to pay your bills because you're not going to be able to work like you thought you should. And so for those people, which is still a big chunk of the legislature, who aren't independently wealthy, this is a problem. And so if the governor threatens to call a special session to say get an important bill that he or she wants passed, those members, which often is the majority of the members, who aren't independently wealthy and that this would financially harm, they put a lot of pressure on the leadership to make sure this stuff gets done. And so usually it ends up getting done. Okay, but it can be used by the governor to say, hey, legislature, this bill that is very important to me, you haven't started working on. If you don't get it done by the end of the legislature session, I'm going to call you into special session. And there ain't much what the legislature can do about it. And so it can be act as a stick to get the legislature on the ball and make sure at least they get the legislature gets the governor's deals and done. Well, another power that the governor has, but very little, is judiciary. The governor has far less influence on the Texas judicial system than the U.S. president. And the main reason is Texas judges are elected, not appointed. And so if you're the president of the U.S., you have influence over the federal judiciary. You appoint federal judges. You appoint appeals court judges. If you're very, very lucky, you get to appoint Supreme Court justices, which you can use those appointments to really influence which way the court will go. And that can have profound impact on how the society, how the government, how everything in the country evolves. Well, the only time the governor of Texas gets to appoint a judge is to fill a vacancy. But even then, that only gives them limited influence. Yeah, they got to appoint that judge who gets to serve out the rest of that term of the judge that had to leave. After that, if they want to continue being a judge, they have to win re-election. And so once that judge wins re-election, whatever kind of beholding they feel to the governor probably flies out the window and is not going to be really important anymore. And so they can fill vacancies. The one area where the governor of Texas has very little power relative to other chief executives is the ability to grant pardons and reprieves. Well, what is a pardon? Or what is a reprieve? Well, if you are pardoned, if you know what the word means, it means you are forgiven. The governor can literally forgive you of your crime, assuming it's a state crime. If it's a federal crime, they can't do this. And they make the crime go away. You are literally no longer legally guilty of any crime. The crime doesn't exist anymore. It's as if they took an eraser and erased it, now it's not there. And so they can grant, traditionally, governors can grant pardons. They also can grant reprieves. If you're pardoned, you no longer have a crime, and if, say, you're in prison, they immediately release you because you're no longer guilty of a crime. A reprieve is a little bit different. A reprieve says, yes, you are still guilty of the crime that you were convicted of. But for whatever reason, the governor feels the punishment was not appropriate. Like you were being too harshly punished. And they can say, okay, say you were facing the death penalty. Maybe there's some serious questions about whether you should have been convicted or not. But not enough to get the courts to overturn your conviction. But the governor can look at it and say, this is a little bit shaky. So I'll tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to give you a reprieve. We're no longer going to execute you. Instead, I'm going to convert your execution to a life sentence without parole in prison. That simply means now you're going to spend the rest of your life in prison without being able to leave. One of the reasons you would do that is that if, say, in some time into the future, they develop the evidence that says, okay, yeah, this person is innocent, then the governor can go back or the courts can go back and say, okay, you're free to go. If they've executed you, they can't exactly bring you back to life. And that is probably the major issue with the death penalty for those who are pro or those who are con. That is probably one of the most important issues, is the possibility of executing an innocent person. If you put an innocent person in prison, you can release them. If you execute an innocent person, then there's not much you can do for them. And so most governors can do that. The Texas governor cannot. Now, at one time they could, until about the 1930s. About 1930, there was a very popular governor here in Texas, and he went by the name of Paul Ferguson. Paul Ferguson was what's known as a populist, and so he pursued policies that the common people really liked. But the business community didn't care for it so much, and they controlled the legislature at the time. And so they got the legislature, both the House and the Senate, to vote for impeachment and for the Senate to convict. And he was kicked out of office. Well, that meant the lieutenant governor served whatever amount of the term that they had. Well, then they had to elect a new governor. Well, technically, Paul Ferguson could not run again. He had been impeached and removed, so he was barred by the state constitution from ever running for public office again. So his wife decided to run. And Paul Ferguson was still very popular with the people of Texas. And so Ma Ferguson, his wife, whose name everybody called Ma Ferguson, ran for governor. And she ran on governor on a campaign slogan of along the lines of, vote for Ma, get Paul too. Well, Paul Ferguson was so popular, Ma Ferguson was elected. Well, Ma Ferguson ended up having a problem. She had an incredibly tender, soft heart. And so any inmate that wrote her a letter, back then there was no social media, so you had to write a physical letter, that said that, told her that, the reason I got involved in crime because I was so abused as a child, I had this horrible life growing up, and that's why I killed or raped or stole or whatnot, she would pardon them. And she started pardoning people who were serial murderers or type, serial rapists. I mean, some of the worst criminals that the state of Texas had to offer. Well, after just a little bit of that, the Texas population really started getting upset. And so the state legislature proposed a constitutional amendment that would strip that authority away from the governor and give it to a board of pardons over paroles. The legislation passed. It went before the Texas voters. The Texas voters approved it. And so today, the only thing the governor gets to do is suggest that someone get a pardon or reprieve. Now, the governor does appoint the members of the parole board or the board of pardons and paroles. And so these are his or her appointees, at least some of them are. Whether they will accept the governor's recommendation, though, or not, is up to them. They can accept them or they can reject it. There's not much the governor can do either way. And so the governor of Texas has very, very little judicial power. Well, who can become a governor of Texas? Well, very much like the legislator, there's not much in the way of constitutional requirements. First, you have to be 30 years old. Now, for those of you who are 16 or 17 in this class, that may seem like a lifetime away. But trust me, you're going to blink and you're going to be 30. Or you're going to be 40. Or you're going to be like me and you're going on 55. Okay? You also have to be a U.S. citizen. Naturalized, U.S. born, does not matter. Just got to be a citizen. And then you got to be a resident of the state for at least 5 years. That is all of the actual requirements to be able to run for governor. But very much like what you saw with the legislature or any other elected official, there's the official requirements, and then there is the characteristics that they tend to have. And governors do tend to share certain characteristics. So, for example, all but 2 have been white males. The 2 exceptions, Ma Ferguson, that we already mentioned, and a lady named Ann Richards. Now, Ann Richards should be familiar to some of you, maybe, if you've ever been on campus. The main building, if you're ever on campus there at McConn, that has the tower on it, that's called the Ann Richards Building. And the reason they call it that is because she was governor, and she put when the legislation that allowed for the formation of South Texas College, at the time South Texas College Community College, and we're still a community college district, she helped get it passed and helped get South Texas College created. If it hadn't been for Ann Richards, South Texas College would not exist at all, or definitely at least not in the form that you know today. And so she was very, very important for that. They're the only 2 non-white males, and they were white females. Very much like all politicians, they tend to be older. Okay, governors tend to be at least in their 40s or if they're 50s when they're elected. Just like just about the vast majority of politicians, They tend to come from the upper class, or at least the upper middle class, so they tend to be wealthier. They tend to be very highly educated. Most governors have at least a bachelor's degree, and most have advanced degrees, the most common of which would be law, okay, and business. And so the most common occupation they come from is law, followed fairly closely by business. One other characteristic that most people wouldn't get, especially here in the Valley, is that all of the governors so far have been Protestant. If you don't know what Protestant means, it means you're a Christian, but you're of a non-Catholic denomination. So this will be groups like Baptist, Methodist, Church of Christ, Presbyterian. You could even put in like the Latter-day Saints in that category, Greek Orthodox, etc. Okay, and so we haven't had anybody else who hasn't been a Protestant Christian. Now, these characteristics, some of them are probably going to be around forever. Upper class, highly educated, coming from law and business, those aren't likely to change anytime soon, if ever. The one thing, though, is that will likely be changed would be the white males. At some time, we will have somebody who's elected that's not a white male, or at least not a white female. And the most likely group that will elect the next governor that's not a white male or female would be Hispanics. As we talked about earlier in the semester, Hispanics and Anglos are roughly even 40%, although Hispanics have a little bit of a lead now. Within a decade to 15 years, Hispanics will probably make up over 50% of the population. At some point in time, there will be a Hispanic candidate that will run for governor, and they will win. Now, there's already somebody who kind of fits that bill, who's already in statewide politics. Okay, and he has the right last name to win the governorship here in Texas, and he can claim Hispanic origin. If you've ever heard of a man named George P. Bush. Now, for a while, he was the Texas Land Commissioner, which is a statewide office. He challenged Governor Abbott in the primaries this last primary season. He didn't win, but he is young, and he's a Bush. Okay, his uncle was George W. Bush, President of the U.S. from 2000 to 2008. His grandfather is George H.W. Bush, President from 88 to 92, and Vice President from 1980 to 1988. And Dad is named Jeb Bush, former governor of the state of Florida. Well, you might ask, well, how can someone named Bush, who's related to the Bushes of Texas, run and say, I'm a Hispanic candidate? Well, Mom's from Mexico. Okay, and so he's half Mexican, half Anglo. He speaks fluent Spanish just as well as he speaks English. And so there's a good chance within the next election or cycle or two that he probably will run and get the nomination from the Republican Party. And then he very well then may win the statewide office of governor. He could easily be the first governor. Now, there are other Democratic Hispanic politicians that, depending on how the politics shakes out over the next decade or so, could easily find themselves winning as well. But he's the most prominent and the most likely simply because he's a Republican. The Republicans control the state of Texas today, and he's a Bush, which is the most important name within the Republican Party. Okay, particularly here in Texas. Okay. Well, if you get elected governor, what do you get? Well, they're fairly well compensated. First of all, unlike the legislature, who gets paid less than poverty wages, the governor has a really good salary. Last I heard is at least $150,000 a year. It probably might be more now. That would put the governor's salary in the top 5% in the state of Texas, and in the top 10% nationally. Okay. You also get the use of the governor's office governor's mansion while in office. Okay, matter of fact, Governor Rick Perry, who was governor for 14 years, ironically, during most of that time, they were remodeling the governor's mansion. It had been built in like the 1850s. It had been modernized like around the 1940s, but hadn't been modernized since. And so they literally had to go in, completely gut the place, redo everything, new electricity, new plumbing, needed to put stuff for internet, all that kind of stuff. Just as they got it completed, they were virtually ready for the governor to move in. A guy burned it to the ground. And so they had to go and rebuild it from ground up. But today, if you get elected as the governor, you get to live in the governor's mansion for at least 4 years. And how many years you get to live there depends on how often you get elected. And so if you already have a house, you can do a couple of things. You could sell it possibly. Or what is much more likely people would do would rent it out, so that once you no longer a governor, you have a house to go to. If you're lucky, maybe you're able to pay off the house while you're doing that. And you can save a lot of money, living expenses. You also get state-funded transportation. Now, one of the things that's not uncommon, most people wouldn't be surprised about, they get limousines, they get Suburbans to drive around, state-owned vehicles. The one that a lot of people might be a little surprised about is they get a state aircraft. The state of Texas owns a number of turboprop and jet aircraft, Lear jets, that kind of stuff. And the governor gets to use the jet or one of the other aircraft. Well, why would the governor of Texas need an aircraft when most governors don't have one? Well, it's kind of simple. If you've ever been across the state of Texas, we're a little bit large. And so for the governor, their most important resource they have is time. And so if it's a Thursday and you need to be in El Paso Friday morning, El Paso's about a 10-hour drive or so from Austin. You don't need to have the governor driving for 10 hours, or in his case, actually riding. And so it's much better for him to get on an airplane owned by the state at a small airport, fly to a small airport in regional airport there in El Paso, take him less than an hour maybe, or at most a couple of hours, do whatever he's got to do or she's got to do there in El Paso, jump back on the plane, and within 2 or 3 hours they're back home. And so it's really important for the governor to be able to get around. Well, you might ask, well, why can't they just take a regular airplane? Well, first of all, that's a lot less convenient. That takes a lot more time. And remember, the most important thing that the governor has is time. That's the most important thing. The other is some issues around security. Okay, now, Governor of Texas isn't the president. They don't need the governor. Texas doesn't need the security that the Secret Service provides the president. But they do get a security detail. Anytime you see the governor go anywhere, there's 4 or 5 or 6, 7 men, generally, in 3-piece suits, short-cut hair. Those are DPS agents who have gone through special training to be security. And so it's similar to what the president has, just not to the same scale. And then lastly, you get a staff of several hundred people. You actually get a personal chef. Believe it or not, the governor has to host state dinners where people come in. And so you need somebody to cook for these events, and they cook for the governor and his family as well, or her family as well. Okay, and so one of the perks of being the governor. Matter of fact, it's a pretty nice feather to put in your hat if you're the chef. If you're the chef for the governor for a few years or however long, when you go out to try to find another job, at least especially in the state of Texas, but really anywhere, if you're putting on your resume, I was the official chef for the state of Texas, for the governor of the state of Texas. And that's going to look pretty good on a resume. Maybe the only one that would be better is that, by the way, I used to cook for the President of the United States. Okay, that obviously would be even a more important deal. All right, so that's some of the things you get. Well, what is the main reason that the governor of Texas isn't very powerful? Well, it has to do with a concept called the plural executive. That the power of the chief executive, that most chief executives have, in Texas, much of that power has been taken away from the governor and given to other statewide elected officials. And this really weakens the governor by distributing that power amongst other people. Matter of fact, the only person that he gets to appoint is the Texas Secretary of State. Now, at the national level, Secretary of State is the most important advisor to the president. At Texas, not nearly as important at the state level. The main thing that the Secretary of State takes care of, and this is very important in a democracy, are elections. But they don't really have any policy influence. And so that really limits how important of a position it is. Now, making sure elections happen appropriately with all that kind of stuff is very important. But it's not like being able to make important policy decisions. And so, because you have all of these appointed positions, this significantly weakens the governor of Texas. And it does this because these other officials are independently elected statewide. And so one of the most important power that a governor can have is to say, I'm elected by the people, all the people. If you're the president of the U.S. and a member of Congress says, well, I think we got to do this, and you're the president, and you say, because my people and where I got voted for, this is what they want. The president says, well, that's good, that's important, but I think we ought to do this other. And by the way, all of the American people voted for me. And so that gives the governor added influence. And so these other groups are independently elected. Often they are independently selected. They're independently funded. The governor has very little to nothing to do with their winning their office. And so they do not feel beholden to the governor at all. The governor probably had very little and may have had nothing to do with them getting elected. As a result, they can and do have different policy goals and agendas. What they want to do and their position the office that they hold can be and is often very different than what the governor wants. And because the governor can't say, well, I represent the people of Texas, well, they can, but this other office holder can say, well, so do I. And I was elected to do this job, which means we don't know why they elected you, but we do know that they wanted me to do this job the way I said I was going to do it. And so they have their own goals and agenda. They're going to do what they want. They can even be from a different political party. You literally can have a Republican governor and a Democratic lieutenant governor, or a Democratic railroad commissioner, or whatever the other statewide offices are, attorney general, whatnot. And so if they're from a different political party, they're just not going to do what the governor tells them, because they have different beliefs than what the governor has, because they're from a different party. But even if you're from the same party of the governor, these elected officials are going to guard their power and turf. They're simply not going to let the governor come in and say, you must do this the way I want. They're going to tell the governor, no. I was elected to do this job. I'll do it the way I think. The best way for the governor to do about it is go to them and try to convince them. Try to kind of cajole them. Or at least try to see if you can't get some kind of compromise where you do it part of the way I want it and part of the way that you want it, that kind of stuff. But ultimately, whoever is in these positions can tell the governor no. And there's not a whole lot the governor can do about it. Okay, that is the rest of the work, or the lecture. We should be able to, I believe the counselors are going to be able to administer the test on Thursday. And so the only thing different about how the test should work is that it would be, instead of me sitting there in the room at the desk, it'll be one of the counselors or somebody like that. If you have any questions, let me know. Okay, contact me through Pronto, but you should have all the lecture notes. Okay, and so you want to go ahead and be studying. You should have been studying over the weekend anyway. And we will have our exam on Thursday like we were supposed to. At least we're going to try. And so hopefully you all have a good day. Again, if you have any questions, reach out to me, especially on Pronto, and we will try to answer any questions that you may have. Have a good day. Goodbye.